Buonasera, io approfitterei della traduttrice questa sera e darò i saluti in lingua inglese. Thank you. My name's Sarah Greenwood. I'm Head of Communication, Marketing and Fundraising here at MASI Lugano. Unfortunately, our director, Tobias Betzeler, couldn't be here this evening, so I have the pleasure of welcoming you tonight to this event, an event that we organise together with IBSA Foundation for Scientific Research. It's, I think, the fifth in the series of SciArt, which is also, but my colleague Jacopo from IBSA will explain a little bit more about SciArt, maybe for those that don't know. I would like to give a very warm welcome to our two guests tonight. You'll meet them very soon. Very, very honored to have two renowned people, let's say curators from the art world from different countries, Switzerland and Italy. I have my colleague here, the curator of the event and curator of MASI, Francesca Benini, who'll give you a little introduction as to what the theme will be about tonight. I'll leave it there. I think Jacopo has a few words to say, so really very warm welcome and thank you very much.
Grazie Sera, io vi do il benvenuto da parte di IBSA Foundation per la ricerca scientifica, che è una fondazione appunto della omonima azienda farmaceutica basata qui in Ticino, e noi abbiamo deciso di sviluppare questo bellissimo progetto che facciamo in collaborazione con il MASI Lugano e con il LAC Lugano Arte e Cultura ormai da 3 anni. L'idea di questo progetto è di portare artisti, curatori, scienziati, persone del mondo della cultura e della scienza per discutere e analizzare insieme questa relazione che è appunto quella tra due mondi che non sono poi così distanti, come vedremo anche questa sera, che sono arte e scienza. Lo facciamo perché appunto in qualità di fondazione per la ricerca scientifica abbiamo un po' la mission che è quella di una scienza per tutti, quella quindi di portare la scienza e i contenuti scientifici a più persone e a più pubblici diversi. Da ormai 6-7 anni siamo partner di ricerca scientifica del MASI, che per noi è un onore esserlo, e quindi abbiamo sviluppato insieme questo bellissimo progetto. Questa sera avremo 2 ospiti di eccezione, adesso Francesca ve le presenterà un po' più nel dettaglio. Io prima di concludere volevo ringraziare tutti il team che lavora a questo progetto, la mia collega Sara Comodo e Claudia Pastori, che con noi assieme al team MASI hanno permesso la realizzazione di questo evento, e vi porto anche i saluti della nostra direttrice Silvia Misiti, che purtroppo è all'estero per un impegno improvviso e che vi saluta. Ultime 2 informazioni: al termine del talk ci sarà ovviamente spazio per le vostre domande, quindi non siate timidi assolutamente, e poi ci sposteremo qui dietro per un piccolo brindisi insieme, così si potrà continuare la conversazione. Vi ringrazio tutti di essere venuti e buon evento.
Buonasera a tutti, anche da parte mia. A me è l'onore di presentare le nostre 2 ospiti di stasera. Chi del pubblico conosce un po' questi appuntamenti sa che negli ultimi anni abbiamo spesso invitato degli artisti per indagare il loro contatto con la scienza nelle loro ricerche artistiche. Quest'anno abbiamo deciso di concentrarci un po' di più sulle istituzioni culturali, ovvero guardare come questa ibridazione tra scienza e arte avviene anche nei contesti intorno alla cultura e all'arte. E quindi le nostre ospiti stasera non sono delle artiste, ma sono 2 curatrici. Chus Martínez, che è una tra le voci più influenti dell'arte contemporanea oggi, è direttrice dell'Institute Art, Gender and Nature presso l'Accademia di Arti e Design di Basilea, è curatrice dello spazio espositivo della scuola, der TANK, e anche curatrice associata della fondazione TBA 21, che è Thyssen-Bornemisza per l'arte contemporanea, con base a Madrid e a Venezia. Il suo percorso di ricerca si muove all'intersezione tra diverse discipline, ed è segnato dalla riflessione sui legami tra arte, natura, tecnologia e sapere scientifico. Fa parte del consiglio direttivo di CIMAM, l'International Committee for Museums, anzi mi diceva che ha avuto una riunione di 4 ore ieri, che l'ha stancata. È stata capo curatrice presso il Museo del Barrio di New York e al MACBA di Barcellona, ed è stata prima ancora direttrice del Frankfurt Kunstverein. però cura tantissimi progetti, è molto attiva, e tra gli ultimi di cui si è occupata è la direttrice della 36esima Biennale di Ljubljana in Slovenia. Con lei, in dialogo, che la intervisterà, o appunto forse è più giusto dire che dialogherà con lei, Barbara Casavecchia, anche lei curatrice, è una scrittrice e anche lei insegna all'Accademia di Brera di Milano, ed è anche chief editor della rivista Mousse, e i suoi articoli, saggi e recensioni sono spesso incentrati sull'arte contemporanea italiana, le culture visive e i femminismi, e sono apparsi su tantissime riviste, per citarne solo alcune che conoscete tutti: Freeze, Flash Art, Spike, ma anche La Repubblica. Loro si sono già conosciute, loro si conoscono, hanno collaborato proprio nel contesto del TBA, della Fondazione Thyssen-Bornemisza per l'arte contemporanea, in particolare nei progetti intorno all'Ocean Space. E questo sicuramente è una buona base da cui partire, una, possiamo dire, amicizia. Io cedo la parola a loro e anche al palco e auguro a tutti buona serata. Magari un'ultima cosa, i ringraziamenti anche da parte mia. Ringrazio i miei colleghi di IBSA, Sara Comodo, Jacopo Crespi e Silvia Misiti, che appunto non è qui stasera, ma anche tutti i miei colleghi al MASI che collaborano per questi eventi, in particolare Taisse Grandi Venturi, che con me si occupa dei contenuti, e le colleghe della comunicazione, a parte Sara Greenwood che avete visto prima, anche Laura Pomari e Martina Santurri, e Selin Muschietti che si occupa degli eventi da noi. Benissimo. Buona serata.
Wow. Oh, okay, I just managed to make the faces out of that screen, but yeah, it's kind of hunting. So I hope that the speaking in English is okay. I'm not a native speaker, but so that my Spanish accent may make it even easier for you to understand. So I was wonder when I was invited, which is a big honor to be here talking about art and science, I was wondering and asking myself, actually, when was I associated with science? I think when was it the moment that I start being associated as somebody that may know something about science, which is definitely not the case. And then I was probably the answer to that is a series of circumstances that happen around the preparation of Documenta 13. Documenta 13 was happening in 2012, and I was the co-curator together with Caroline Christoph Bakargiev. As you know, Documenta happens every 5 years, and it did happen in Kassel, as always. So in the preparation of that exhibition, we asked ourselves something that actually Donna Haraway asked herself, which is, who do you touch when you touch your dog? Like, what is it that you are in relation with? So there is, and today when we talk about other kinds of intelligences and talk about intelligences with plural and not with singular, we kind of react to it in a positive way. When today we say that there is more than one intelligence, and not only artificial, but also perhaps shared intelligences with many living beings, we are kind of absorbing that, and we say, or we not, and we tend to agree with this type of statements. But actually, historically speaking, this is something quite new. And also, the question is not only when we start to accept certain statements and assumptions, but also when we start to understand the complexities that those assumptions imply. And definitely at the core of it, in my opinion, was always art. So you say art and science, and for many people, when they talk about this and, it relates it in an horizontal way, but in our mind, we tend to give a little bit more importance to science because it seems to be more relevant for life. And art is just there, but it's just if you die, you are not gonna call an artist, but a doctor. So in that sense, it's something that we share, that this and is not completely horizontal. So it was very important for me, out of curiosity, to actually investigate what do we say when we say science. And actually, is science in the shape that we assume it is? How much do we know about the form of science? I know a lot about the form of art because I work with artists, and they convey me the form that an art and a practice happens. But do we really know the practice of science, or we only know the mediatic vision or the message that science is conveying through the media, pharmaceuticals and space science, artificial intelligence, big names, mostly very abstract. But how much do we know about the making, but also how much do we assume about this community? So I remember very clearly that because we wanted to exhibit something that many curators hate, called Salvador Dalí, at Documenta 13, I needed first to fight for it a lot. So every time I said to Caroline, oh, I'm dreaming with a room full of Salvador Dalí, everyone just got the grips. Oh, no, not Salvador Dalí, because, it's the only artist that everyone knows. And just because of that, it's already kind of unqualified. And then they asked me, why do you want to have a room full of Salvador Dalí? And I said, because I hate it. I think I truly hate it. There is no way that as a Spaniard you go anywhere and they ask you, where are you from? And then you say, from Barcelona. Barcelona, we love Barcelona. Oh, we love Picasso and Salvador Dalí. So that's the three things that get associated with your identity. So instead of fighting it, why if we do a room with Salvador Dalí? Salvador Dalí, very, very, very interesting figure, had as a hobby / passion, complete let's say, obsession, to interview the scientists of his time. So he used to sit at the lobby of the Hotel Astoria in New York, and he wrote letters to quantum physicists nonstop, and to many of the geneticists of his time, trying to get them for an interview, to have a conversation about something. The only thing that really concerned him was actually if science had a better grasp to the understanding of life than art. So if you would be actually able to enter the archive of Salvador Dalí, which is in Figueras, which is quite difficult, and now they are kind of trying to rethink it, you would encounter hours and hours of this person as an artist trying to get a grasp of what life is for science. And those interviews are fascinating. So, but because of that, I needed to actually talk to a very important scientist, which is at the Rockefeller Foundation and University in New York, called Alexander Tarakovsky. Tarakovsky is at the core of a research that actually figured out that, and we know it by now, but at, let's say, 10 years and 10-something years, in the past, that was not so known, that not only genetics determine who we are, but actually the memory of the cells determine who we are. So it's not only that our cells have and carry information, and this information actually determines the life that we are going to live, but also the memory and the experiences that those cells have. What are the experiences of cells? Because this is very, very difficult to measure. The only possibility that scientists had to measure it was actually to go to extreme situations. So he and a team of many others determined that if you are in the complete fear of losing your life, this fear has a form and a memory in your cells. So if you go through really impressive amounts of stress where you think that you are going to die, but not only you, but you are going to collectively die. And I think that we know what's going on in the world. Like if we not only fear that we die as an individual, but the whole community, everything that we are and represent symbolically and physically, if we fear that this is gonna disappear, our body changes. So this is a major discovery of the 20th century, late 20th century, and he discovered many things. I think there is, of course, mental health issues that are related to this memory, but very physical traits that change, things that happen in our body that are a before and after this fear. Like, for example, forms of body change and obesity. So I met him in London first, and it is an interesting question. When you are working in the field of art, and because of all the prejudices that kind of surrounded the practice, you think that if you are gonna go into the community of scientists, it's gonna be very difficult that they answer an email. Why do you think that a scientist is not going to answer an email coming from somebody working in the field of arts? Because actually, as Peter Gallison was kind of very well describing in his book Objectivity in 2007, we are educated and constructed as a society to believe that the scientific community has an autonomy and also a close into itself that cannot be disturbed. Who are we to actually knock at the door of science? Science not only is closed in itself, should be closed in itself. While art and the practitioners of art, we are dedicated, and our mission and goal in life is be here with you, actually talking about what we do and trying to transmit and share the values to the society, but not so science. The values of science are actually historically determined as being emitted, almost like a magic stone, something that goes into the social, but not in a direct form. You don't really expect scientists to go on television, to go on conference. Today they do. But historically, you did not expect it. Actually, you doubt those that try to transfer the knowledge. And it's not only that you doubted, they doubted. So I've been in many conferences, and if a scientist is able to speak well, or actually dedicates their life to transmission, it's automatically doubted as a good scientist. So transmission is not something that is constructed as a positive thing, but as a negative thing, which is already interested, and it has an historical form. So this person answered actually my mail in the, let's say I sent it at 9 o'clock in the morning, and the email came back at 9:15 saying, definitely I want to meet, let's meet in a cafe in London, I'm looking so-and-so, we never met before. And then, I opened the door, and this guy was like, oh my God, I never thought ever that somebody dealing with curating, and of course I mentioned in my email that I was part of the Documenta team, that I would be invited. And then he said, can I exhibit? And I said, no, you're a scientist. And then said like, okay, then from now on and from this conversation, I try to do all I can to end up in the exhibition. And said, try hard. And then we started talking. And one of the most fascinating things that he said to me is something that never occurred to me. And then he said, of course, we do science in negative terms, meaning epigenetics try to determine the negative impact of this fear that I try to describe to you. Because the negative trait, the fear, the stress, it can be measured. But because I am a scientist, the contrary should be true. In other words, I am absolutely convinced that those communities that don't fear, that they don't think that they are losing their lives, and on top of it, those communities that are absolutely committed to culture and to very abstract thinking and the exposure of activities that don't have any direct relationship with a function, they live much longer. And that this is something that in the future is what actually we are going to call, and we are here today because many scientists are trying to determine that, is actually the science of aging. So aging is directly related to culture and art, he said. So at that moment, it really completely changed my view on science. I actually never thought till that moment that there could be a new, let's say, a second life to the history of the relationship in between art and science. Because it has been a first and second life to it already. let's call it an historical zero moment in the Renaissance, and the question of a relationship with the thirst for knowledge, alchemia, and you know, this type of more romanticized notion of the relationship in between aesthetics and science. But then it was a very, very big moment in the 60s that actually I am more and more interested in, which is when science actually relocated a lot of artists at the core of an interest mostly dealing with mathematics and also cosmology. So very few people know, but NASA, for example, had an amazing residency program that started in 1962 and actually was running till very few years ago, I think 2020 or 22, if I am not confused. But also the MIT has another program, very, very important, that was called also Art and Science, called EATS, that also started around the same year. So we had this type of computer, cybernetic information type of interest coming from science that wanted artists mostly for giving a face to questions that are too abstract to have a face. So it was that moment of inquiry in between. But what I never kind of expected in the same way is a new interest for those science that are life science, biology, for example, epigenetics, for example. I thought that those that are actually in a different connection with this were less interested in art and actually more difficult to connect. Because they already have, like, let's say, a direct access to the mysteries of life, if you want to call it like that. So by the time that I was talking to Tarakovsky, I realized that it would be really interesting to form some sort of a group that would only put the commonalities together. And this, as I said, started in Documenta, but it was actually a little bit later when I moved to TBA 21, which is a foundation that actually Barbara knows also very well, that operates both in Madrid and in Venice, to not doing something more than to relate these two groups and try to commission artworks. Artworks that are not there because they illustrate any theory, but artworks that are actually growing out of the knowledge of these two fields kind of touching upon each other. And the biggest surprises of my work in this field has been kind of the most obvious things. First, as I was saying, scientists are quite open, but also scientists that they work with quite speculative ideas, they encounter the same amount of resistance, if not more, than artists do with the society. So in a way, we are always facing this idea that art is part of an elitarian movement. There is roots into that prejudice, and the roots are actually a confusion, a misunderstanding. I would say, and this is my theory, that the moment that mostly media started to sell contemporary art and contemporary art culture as part of an elitarian society, it started because we kind of perceive something that is actually happening now, and it's happening in its own terms, which is thinking that contemporary culture could be part of the luxus industry. But actually now we know that the luxus industry has nothing to do with art, and that actually art has been having a form and a social form that has nothing to do with service providing to the elites in any way. But it was a moment of confusion that is very difficult to deconstruct. And I must say that many scientists speculating and being and working in tracks that are not the same tracks that the industry science is promoting encounter very similar resistance inside the communities. Another interesting moment that I never thought of is the fact that because of what I was saying, the way that science is articulating itself as a self-explanatory community that is close and autonomous is very unreceptive to historical development and historical morpho changes, like, for example, colonialism. So science has a very hard time talking about colonialism and talking about their own responsibilities, but also the form of the colonial inside science, for example. Another question that was also a very surprising question is the simple question of gender, like gender inside the field of science. Not only questions of gender that they don't research, but also the position of female scientists inside the community, and so on and so forth. So I must say that in the last 15 to 20 years, it has been really incredible, the interest of those two fields, I would say life science, to work with artists. That's why you cannot be surprised in any way. And if you actually start scrolling the programs of exhibitions in many museums, from the big to the small ones, to the ones in Europe, to the ones in Latin America, Americas, and Asia, you would encounter many projects dealing with the question of nature. And nature would be actually the field, like the piazza, where we both encounter each other. Somehow, nature has been the reason why we came together again. If in the 60s it was technology, now it's life and the preservation of life. So, Barbara.
Hello. So, as you may have noticed, Chus is also an amazing storyteller. So I think, writer shall also be something we may say about how you operate. And you also write beautifully, and I've also taken some notes in terms of some of the titles that you often choose for bringing things together. Like the talk for tonight, la fortuna di avere la natura come cultura. That is the chance of having nature as culture. For a second, I wanted to go back to what you were saying about the 60s and also bringing the possibilities of having nature as culture at the core. Because I was thinking you were talking about scientists and biologists, for instance. And I just think, the impact of the writings of a thinker like Rachel Carson, who was a biologist, and whose books, like Silent Spring, had an incredible impact, not only on the scientific community. Sorry, I think maybe it's my earring, so maybe I remove it. Not only on the scientific community, I would say, but also on society at large, just by the possibility of generating one image that was the result of something we know very well: spring, silent, the absence of bees and the absence of insects that really generate the soundtrack of that experience. So you remove something so simple, apparently, and in your head, an entire universe of imagination opens up. So I think that some elements of how science speaks outside of its own community has also been part of a general concern since the 60s, because of all the sort of dark side of, industrialization, capitalism, and many things unfolding that have a broad impact on the planet. So how science speaks and how it makes itself understood, it's also through the capacity of building these great spaces for reimagining. And I think that's also where it meets artists and artists meet sciences. Because as you wrote, I think, art is not theory. it's a way of thinking. So many of the artists that have been now coming up, maybe you would like to pick one of these works, because I'm quite familiar with them, because many of them you involve them in this process of research that generated a number of exhibitions. And I think this is also interesting in terms of practices, how much time you give to research, and why is this part of your curatorial process, for instance?
Yeah, I think what is really more and more important, because, again, my theory, we are not reading literature anymore. And we are not reading literature with the intensity we should anymore. We are also not socializing literature anymore. We don't go out the house and share a book, share the plot. We don't really just meet like a Sunday afternoon to talk about a book that actually changed our life in the moment that we are reading it. Because that changed a lot, we have a big problem connecting. Because we have a big problem projecting, connecting, and actually seeing things in a relationship. And this is something that, because scientists are also not good readers, also have. And we kind of imagine them in a certain way, but actually they are in another. And they are into the particulars, and they have a hard time getting out of the particulars and putting them there in the social. But on the other hand, science has an idealistic mission that wants actually to transform the social in a way. So the kind of new encounter in between scientists and artists has as a mission to enhance a connectivity that actually would enhance a conversation that is larger than the particular discovery of a particular research. And also you need to see that they are also like artists in their studios doing that particular research in a super concentrated manner, and they don't really have the capacity to relate that to the many other discoveries. So, for example, we are seeing here the Cigatera project by Diana Policarpo. So it's, there is an interesting thing that started to be observed. I think the phenomena exists since the 16th, let's say since Cristobal Colon kind of was in the waters for the first time of the Caribbean. They kind of noticed that some people eating fish was having problems that some people that didn't have. Nervous paralysis, vomiting, and eventually even dying. So the cigatera, so the toxicity that you kind of, you get ill with when you eat fish, of a certain kind of fish, was known. But it was not till the 80s that it was known and perceived in such an impressive way. So it all started actually in January, February, 83. They started noticing that some of the coral reefs of Costa Rica starting to bleach, and they immediately sent notice to the whole stations observing the marine reservations around the Caribbean and the same area, Mexico, Cuba, you know, República Dominicana, Jamaica. They started asking if somebody else observed a similar thing. And then at the beginning it was a no, and then they thought, okay, that may be some sort of a by chance thing to happen. But then like a typhoon just happened in February, like kind of a month later, and kind of wish away like all the coral reef of Jamaica. So Jamaica, that had an incredible coral reef, one of the most beautiful on earth, and Jamaica, that was also codependent of the reef to produce folklore, songs, poems, stories, and so on, over the course of 15 days with a typhoon, have seen how the whole reef was covered first with mud, and they could actually not notice what was happening, but when the whole effect of the typhoon was going away and people thought it was another typhoon, and we were like, you know, things are gonna go back to normal, things were not going back to normal, but something horrendous happened, and it was that all the corals lost the color. So imagine the shock of going from colorful to white. They bleach, and there was no return to it. Like it has been waiting months and years, and the coral, and today is one of the biggest problems, the coral was kind of bleaching. The reason why the coral was bleaching is not ciguatera, but the moment that they were researching the bleaching of the coral, they discovered that there is some sort of connection in between certain fishes eating certain algae, and these algae that were healthy, like let's say a year ago, if they eat it now, they would they would get ill, but not the fish. The fish was okay, but you. If you would eat that fish, the transmission through the fish would make you ill. So this is something that is actually occupying science since centuries. And there is no particular answer to it. They know that there is some bacteria and virus interacting, and there is actually quite a complex chain of things happening. But Diana Policarpo proposed a project for us that was to actually reunite with all the communities of scientists dealing with ciguatera and trying to figure out first if there is unanimosity, like meaning if people would just agree on the cause of ciguatera. And second, go to the place that has the most ciguatera problems in the world, which is a small island that is attached to the Canary Island in Spain, but actually belongs to Portugal. And this that looks like a paradise, and it's a rock which is really, really volcanic and beautifully red, is actually surrounded by an incredible amount of fishes, and actually a paradise for fishing if you want, with the exception that you cannot eat the fish. And that all the locals know that actually those fishes are contaminated with ciguatera. But not only those fishes, but also it kind of answers one of the questions that you may have. For example, how come that if you go to certain places in the planet that they lack really food and are surrounded by fish, they don't eat it? And I don't know if you have any experience in the Caribbean, but for example, I do have an experience in Cuba, for example. And then nobody touches the fish. And they tell you that the fish is poison. And then you just, in a kind of naive way, say, but oh, well, come on, we can do a grill party, or you can access, and you can do some fishing and reduce the problem of the food, for example, supply in Cuba, which is very, very big. And then they all say, yes, but you can't really not touch it. And it's very interesting that from that statement to why, there is no why. There is only the fact that certain white fishes of certain communities at certain times in history are really poisonous. So Diana proposed to actually do a replica of this island that is kind of floating, let's say, in a poisonous water, where in a paradoxical way the fish can live. So it's only the humans that are threatened. And then she thought, it's really interesting because it's a scientific research going on that has no facts that can help us, and is also surrounded by myths, because the myths say, don't touch the fish. The songs say, don't eat the fish. The poem said, you know, the ocean is full of beauty / also poison. So, you know, literature tells you what to do. Science has no answer to that problem, and humans are actually acting on a problem that is there. So we thought it was really interesting exactly on what you are saying, because we need to put the problems in a relationship. And then all of a sudden we end up with a project that was giving visibility to something which is really interesting, which is a, let's say, systemic change and transformation of the conditions of the ocean that made that many species that would provide nourishment if they resist our overfishing are actually contaminated, which is a big problem. And also the idea that there is a signal that is invisible to the eyes of the human that for centuries has been producing an enormous amount of folklore and storytelling. So for her, this kind of project was incredible for all of us. It was an incredible opportunity to actually examine the moment of storytelling, connectivity that happened in a, let's say, intuitive way, because we sense that something is wrong, and scientific research, for example?
I think one crucial element of, several of these processes, which you mentioned, but I'd like to return to, is the fact that this way of looking at those interconnections comes from a perspective which is not the usual terrestrial perspective, one may say, because everything is looked at from the position of water, and we're seated across a big body of water, and of course it's just outside of the window, but it's often perceived as there's this massive separation, and the way we frame our understanding of what is dry, what is wet, how do they connect, how these two things are kept apart or together, deeply changes when one looks at things from below the surface and upwards, or how everything is in fact part of a given cycle, the cycle of water, for instance. So for me, and I also had the chance of working for a 3 years project, and I really mean the luxury of having 3 years to do research, which is something that is often not so included in the possibility of thinking through exhibitions, because they often zoom. Everything has to be done very fast. But this time for articulating observation and giving artists time to do their research and come up with their own ideas was very special. And I think it also deeply changed our ways of thinking collectively, because suddenly we were looking at it from the water.
Yeah, I think that it's so interesting that these projects with art have been challenging a lot. I think what for me is fascinating is the fact that 10 years ago, when you talk about art and science, or you talk about many of these things, people was very skeptical. And nowadays, it seems that everyone wants to know more about how can we have an impact, and how can we actually understand a little bit more, so that we can act upon this understanding. Not that it's easy right now, but I think that there is like a new movement in the social that is being created, that perceives that it's not only about going and seeing interesting exhibitions, but it's about a new collectivity that can be formed around, for example, a project like that or projects like that. Mm-hmm. So you perceive immediately the interest of having conversations. So let's say that these projects are really, on the one hand, about art and science, that they really provide you with some ideas that are easier to grasp, that they also provide scientists with the opportunity of opening up some of the research and some of the discoveries to a larger audience. They provide artists with the possibility of also working in fields that otherwise are more abstract. But it provides all of us something that is more and more needed, and it's going to be much more needed in the near future, which is a revival of oral culture. So because we work incredible amount of hours and we are tired, because this tiredness makes, as I was saying, that we read less and we are less attached to literature. And also because we are exhausted and we are less attached of conversations in the oral way. We send messages, we are in social media, and we are actually very, very attached to the, broadcast platforms, Netflix, the one I hate the most, but there are many that we can name. It is difficult for us to exercise oral culture. And oral culture is fundamental, not only to have a relationship with each other, but also to test and sense the possibilities that we have of togetherness or not. So in my way, I do believe that these projects that they name art and science, but we could also say they are actually opening up art and knowledges, in plural, scientific knowledge, but many other knowledges, to the possibility of a new phase of orality in our culture, a new phase of actually having dinner and then, asking if we are going to have a walk, and perhaps sitting in a bench and talking to somebody we have absolutely no knowledge of. The possibility of reactivating our orality and the possibility of talking to others is something that is fundamental, politically speaking, but also in terms of knowledge, because very soon the text and many of the actions that we are going to be doing or acting upon can be replicated by machines. In that sense, it is even more important to do something that machines cannot do, which is have conversations. So conversations, and believe me, are going to be back. And to know how to have a conversation is difficult. So in a way, these are sources of immense complex conversations. And complex conversations are very necessary, because the conversation is something that has the possibility of grasping something complex, but rendering it possible for those that are talking, because otherwise you cannot continue talking. And that's the important part of them.
I mean, I've seen many people walking into that place and that space, and I think that work specifically, I mean, was also the source of endless simple conversations, which is also, to me, a very interesting part of how art sometimes has the power of breaking down certain boundaries or disciplines. I've seen kids running to these rocks. The rocks were speaking. That is an element that it's kind of invisible from this picture, but they were speaking with their own voice. So they were kind of magically telling this story, and then the story was being told from multiple viewpoints. And there was an element of being immersed in this enchanting atmosphere, which I think allowed for also a number of very simple questions to emerge. So, and I think this is something that needs to occur, at least in my experience of people going to see exhibitions, but also people who may be intimidated by not understanding everything in terms of how science communicates, which languages it's using, how accessible are certain levels of knowledge, while art has this kind of fluid power to open up the doors, because one can also simply ask, what is it? What does it stand for? Why is it shaped in this way? For instance, I mean, here, this is a work by Claudia Comte, I think, which is also related to the reef and other things. So those shapes, those forms, speak also of several other stories. So how are you interested when you work on these projects with the artist to bring together, I mean, the sort of the element of the exhibition and the element of the story, which then tells of other stories and other stories? And
so this is a project that we did in the Thyssen, which is the museum for more, it's a classic collection in the upstairs. And a few years ago, we convinced the museum to activate one of the spaces for contemporary art and actually showcase the commissions that we are doing with this TBA 21 that puts together scientists and artists and contemporary artists. This project was super interesting for me because it connects with the one of the Cigatera. It goes and speaks about the same area, Jamaica. Jamaica lost the reef. There is this kind of ultra positivistic mind of certain parts of science and technology, which are different. Not all technology is science, but parts of the technology thinking is also scientific, that they think that every destruction produces regeneration. So right now, for example, we are in an interesting phase because we are in the phase of total reprogramming and total destruction. So there is actually a predominant mentality that happens every once in a while that believes that there is some sort of possibility of destroying, and out of it something new and better comes out. This is kind of a mythical thinking, and it's kind of penetrating our political thinking in a really, really dangerous way. It's not new, but it has its reason. And in my opinion, one of the reasons why we are becoming so violent is not only the question of energy and the fact that we need certain energy and we are codependent of it, and we start territorial extractivistic wars in order to just get a hold of this energy, but also because we are very invested since certain decades to a very Darwinistic idea of what science and technology is going to bring to the social. So in our colonial mind, we have been creating a narrative that says that there is intelligence that is very predominant, which is the human intelligence. But then on top of it, as a sort of exoskeleton of the human, we are going to be able as a species to produce an intelligence that on the one hand is going to be enslaved by us. So this artificial intelligence is going to be doing things that we don't want to do, like labor, and it's going to take away things that we are going to command what to say, and the intelligence is going to do it on the one hand. But out of the logic of enslaving intelligence, it's going to be a revenge. It can be that the machines kill us. So we have always this idea that we are going to be nihilistically erased from the face of Earth because of something that we created ourselves. This kind of narrative, which is very modernistic, that's very colonial, that is actually very science fictional, and so on and so forth, but it has been established in ways that is producing violence. It is a violent narrative, and it's a violent narrative that is kind of penetrating the fabric and the logic, the ways we think without us even being very aware of it. So this violence that is there and is very present also says that if we destroy the reef, we are going to be smart enough, good enough to regenerate the reef. So there is enough scientists and there is enough labs that are trying to regenerate the reef. I don't know how much you know about corals, but corals is a symbiotic, is a collaboration in between a plant and an animal, and therefore the replica of the coral is very difficult because it's actually something circumstantial that establishes itself and produces something environmental. So imagine something that out of the blue happened, but actually in a kind of pop-up way populates the whole coast and makes the coast possible in a certain way. So to replicate it is not so easy. So Claudia was fascinated by a group of scientists which are in Florida, which is actually the ones that are more advanced in trying to replicate the coral. And they are not only trying to replicate the coral because you can replicate the coral without any beauty, so to say. You can actually replicate it as some sort of artificial unit, some sort of stick that you just plant into the coast, and nature would kind of invite the real symbiotic animal and plants to form as a coral. It would take centuries for it to happen. Because we don't have the time, they have been trying to regenerate corals and to make corals first digitally, and from that digital form explore the possibilities of them being biological. So she has been working with them, and she produced this very beautiful video that you are not seeing, but the video is almost like a Disney wall of the animations that the scientists have been creating in understanding the many forms that a coral takes. And then by animating it, it looks almost like an advertisement, like an emoji of a coral. On the back of the emoji of that coral that is in a cube, in a super ultra digital technological way, there is something which is actually biopigment. Is the pigment that is used by many animals in the deep of the sea. So for many centuries we believe that actually animals are not able to see colors, and colors are not existing if daylight cannot penetrate the ocean. But this is because our eyes cannot see it. So after a certain while, there is no light. So for us, the party is over. But certain years ago, one scientist, together with many other scientists, called David Gruber, he was able to replicate, more or less, the eye of a turtle. In replicating the eye of a turtle, he kind of implant in a camera the eye of something that's not the human. Actually, you have seen Jacques Cousteau documentaries when you were young, and actually Jacques Cousteau was actually using the cameras that is a replica of a human. So what he was doing was exploding, like fireworks in the surface of the water to try to make light to go under, to illuminate the water, to be able to film it, because actually our eye camera is not able to film down. So but a few years ago, they made that camera and they discovered something that's in the cover of the National Geographic. If you go online and you search bio glowing turtle National Geographic, you would find that the scientists, for the first time, we all saw that many animals have a lot of colors and they generate light down the water, that there is actually a lot of life and a lot of interaction that happens in a biochromatic way. So what she did was actually painted the walls with this color that is dependent on darkness. So one room of the exhibition was dark, and then the colors were glowing. And the other part of the exhibition, so this was like the color that is alive, so to say, and is kind of nourished by the darkness, in that there is all this light that you see here. All these lamps are so-called dark light, so they replicate the darkness. And these are actually, this is a cemetery or a memorial, let's say, because she went to Jamaica and then she kind of secured the boot of the trees, very, very ancient trees that still are at the coast of the reef, and with those trees she made the same shape of the deceased corals, the corals that disappear with the people of Jamaica. So what you see here is the form of the dead coral, so to say, made of wood. The trees that they were mourning at the shore because the corals disappear, which is a really interesting idea, I think.
I just realized I didn't ask you one very simple question. I mean, going back to simple questions, but why is it such a huge problem if corals disappear? Because this is something that, I mean, very often we have the sensation that we know of certain elements, but how everything is interconnected, it's also, why is it so important to take care of forms of life which are disappearing underwater, because they have a very direct relation to what happens outside of that liquid element.
I went like 3 weeks ago, before opening the biennial in Ljubljana, I went to a tour with a friend of mine, which is an historian, Mansa Renko. Mansa is an amazing historian and took me into a tour in which she wanted to explain me the monuments that populate the public space in Ljubljana. And then in the middle of the tour, we were watching, like we were in front of a door, and I said, but this is a monument? What is this door? And then she said to me, wow, this was my favorite bar when I was a student. It was amazing. And then it was a couple of other friends that were also in the tour, and they said, yes, Chus, you have not known Ljubljana when the bar was open. That bar, do you remember that they opened till 4 every day? Have you been there eating the pommes that they had, and they only served this junk and all these very bad cocktails that they thought that they were imitating American cocktails? The door was closed. They are building a hotel right now. And then this is the disappearance of the reef. So if you ask scientists, why is the reef important? There's a couple of very important biological facts. But most of the fact is actually that the fishes and life met in the reef. So if the bar disappears with the bad French fries, full of color, full of life, something in the biodynamics of the relationship of a species change so much that it affects super ultra negative the building of the coast. So what happens after the disappearance of the reef is that the algae take over. The algae that should be at a certain distance start to be let's say, in the living room, and they shouldn't be there. It's like the corporative hotels, they shouldn't be there, but they are now in your living room. Also the tourists, they shouldn't be there in such an amount, but they are there. The rucksack, the plants, the Starbucks, the McDonald's, the disappearance of the reef. That's that. The color of the reef plays an aesthetic role that actually makes the fishes very, very happy. And they meet there, like the bar in Ljubljana. Gone.
Well, I would love to bring to at least a little interval, but maybe, I mean, I would just love to quote the title of an exhibition you curated that I love so much, and it says, "Metamorphosis, let everything happen to you." So, would anybody like to ask a question?
Yeah, now is the time.
Because now
Good,
it's a good time.
This one.
There are 2 questions.
This is.
Maybe I suggest just to wait for a second. There you are. Then everybody can hear you.
So, la fortuna di avere la natura. My question is basically whether this is the luck of having nature, or, in culture.
As
culture.
As culture. One thing that's an external thing, the nature that we have outside, and the science that you're talking about and so on. But you also have the nature of the individual, the propensities, the capacities, the sensibilities that perhaps allows the artist to make judgments and decisions, and at the end of the day also the art. The nature, the nature of the individual.
It's a super interesting question, because when I wrote the title, I thought that I wanted to say that it would be a lack to understand nature as culture. So to break with the binary of this distinction. And I still think that it would be a lack to break the distinction in between this quite close monadic understanding of the individuum. So it is clear that we are in an incredible mutuality. And I really believe that it would be great to allow things to happen. But history is actually not in my way, because people are now claiming that they want safe space. And kind of my perspective would be to be a little bit unsafe always, in a good way. An unsafety that is sustainable. Let's talk about sustainable unsafety that permanently put us in a togetherness. I'm interested in that. So therefore, I don't recognize that much the importance of the uniqueness of the individual. But I do think, and that's why I think that it's so interesting that artists put themselves in an environment with scientists that historically they were not super well received or even perceived as secondary. And therefore I think that by creating this mutuality, again and again, now it's not perfect, but it's going to take more and more generations, we are producing a new substance where the individual is not anymore so graspable or so close in itself or so autonomous. And I just believe on that. But it's probably my way of thinking, because I think that in order not to be afraid, because everyone is talking, that we are full of fear, and we should, and we are. But on the other hand, it's true that I would like to live in a more open mutuality that would be sustainable. I mean, I don't want to be attacked. I don't want anybody to be attacked, but I would like to be relatable. For example, I was 8. I explained that the other day. My mother is very angry when I say that, but I'm going to say it. We were about to buy shoes for me. We moved to Barcelona. We are not from Barcelona. We are from a region called Galicia in the north. My mother was looking at shoes. She wanted blue shoes. In the coast where I'm from, blue shoes are the shoes you need to have, not red. I wanted them red, sandals. It was very hot. She moved. It was another woman with another kid in that window. And then my mother said, she wants them red. What do you think? This woman looked at both, looked at the daughter, took her out, like, you know, separated, and said, let's go, she's crazy. I still remember that, because my mother, why? Why did it happen? Was she dressed in any particular way? No, it's because we have a particular accent. The way that my mother was speaking, it was clearly the case that this woman was not from there and was speaking with an accent. What I mean is that I believe that we should actually be more locas and go and talk to each other. And therefore dissolve our vision and this really incredible amount of individuality that is very fostered all over. It's fostered in social media, in the news, all over. You are fostered to close in yourself. Also, younger generations. And I think it's a problem.
And if I'm allowed to just add one line, I would personally find it really difficult at that stage to separate myself from that. I perceive our ways of being as with nature instead of, outside of it or separated from it. And this is something that I learned a lot from artists and science speaking together, quite honestly. Well,
but one thing does not exclude the other. There is distinctions and there is differences. But the question is, they are morphing. You know, also, in my distinction, and I believe in mimesis, we also start by being very different, and we come closer to try to mimic each other, to start again to separate. So this kind of cycle of knowledge that we very behavioristically learn in an almost innate way may help us to relate differently and better. But right now it's not happening, or at least not in my experience. And I would like to relate more, because it's the only way. I think I am coming from a type and a part of the world that is polarizing. And I think perhaps in Switzerland it's happening less, but in many other countries it's really polarizing in between people and groups and opinions not being able to. So I am trying to find ways and methods to lessen the polarization. I'm interested in that.
You briefly made reference to cosmology, and in the next days we will have here in the Università della Svizzera Italiana a summer school on the theory, on the aim and the structure of the cosmological theory, and also a couple of workshops on quantum theory. You know, as far as I catch, a common link being the indeterminacy of the theories of cosmology and quantum theory, metaphysical, epistemological consequences of basically the observation of an experiment or something like that. Do you see something in also in arts that is? It seems that is you know, at least from those perspectives, a field that is in science is having again you know, a lot of interest by scientists. Do you see also a parallel in the arts?
Yeah, it's so interesting that you're asking that. Like, 3 months ago, we did at the Institute in Basel a symposium. We do this twice a year. It's kind of a format where we invite scientists and artists to talk about important questions. And the last one was dedicated to quantum physics. And I honestly thought that it's going to be very abstract and very difficult to grasp, and that even the students would not have much interest because it was not related to the practice. And it was the biggest positive surprise ever, because in that intuitive way, things that in the past has been perceived as mystical, and now we know that they actually are entanglements in ways of thinking. So it was so interesting to hear the scientists and the artists talking almost the same language. The question of synchronization, the relativization of the time as we have learned it, the biological time, and relating it. So, you know, everyone tried to grasp each other and to just make sense of that complexity in an experiential way that was absolutely amazing. So I do think that more and more this is also very necessary, because we have we have narratives that are implemented by the industry and by capitalism that also understand time in a certain way, and also the goals of life in a certain way. So by reverting already that understanding of time, you may have a method to revert that narrative and to talk about politics in a completely different way. We invited, for example, Karen Barat, which is a quantum physicist, but also a poet, and very important in talking about queerness and how, for example, quantum physicism is queer at its core. So that was really, it's really amazing to see how you can open a subject and a complexity, and nobody owns that complexity, but it's kind of shared. And that moment of seeing it happen, that was, yeah, emocionante. That was really beautiful. Don't be shy.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk and for the amazing informations. And I was catched by this sentence that you said about art, art as experience, and I really believe that nature could be experience. And maybe you as curators, how do you think that art can be put in museums more as an experience and less as a product? Or, because I just was in Art Basel and I saw these booths, and it was really a lot about products, money, and just this kind of, the market and so on. And how can you...
That's quite literally a supermarket. So, I mean, it is difficult to, at least for me, to imagine art interpreted through that frame only. I think that one of the amazing aspects of having the possibility of bringing together art scientists, ecologies, and cosmologies, because I would also multiply that possibility of not being a unified narrative, and how the language of science, for instance, also changes if it's from North Africa or it's from another area of the planet, and sort of what are the stories there, what are the methods, what are the possibilities, and so forth. But I think, to me, the space which is generated by the conversations that Chus was discussing, that's the place where I feel things can happen. It may start from an object, but the way that object is presented, mediated, discussed, brought around, opened up in order to rediscuss how, I don't know, the provenance of a collection is put together, who's accessing it, which language is it using to communicate with the people who may be interested in it, how food can be a way of building a conversation with part of the audience, and so forth. All those elements, at least to me, are part of what I find really nourishing in that experience. I am not a collector, so I also understand, the pleasure, the necessity, and the importance of sort of acquiring works and maybe putting them in a museum where they can be then shared differently. But to me, it's that live process which makes sense.
Yeah, I think we need to distinguish in between the patrimonial and the rest. So one part is patrimony. I think we have museums that have collections, we have collectors that have collections, we have objects that people collect, and this part is patrimonial. So many people are interested in patrimonial, many people are not. I belong to the ones that are not. I don't see art as patrimonial, but one part of it is patrimonial. So I respect parts of it. But right now we are in a very bad moment of the other side. And we need to recuperate also methods and ways of socializing with art differently. So yes, we could put more experiential art in the museums, but in itself, it would not solve the problem because we need you. So unless you are convinced that you want to go, the only thing that people are going to do is actually modify their behavior to try to catch you. And this is kind of service providing. So if, for example, an institution thinks that you are not going to go to a conversation or to a project that is actually dealing with interesting questions but it's a little bit demanding, they're going to start throwing some sort of, they are going to lower and lower the standard till they just do what today is called immersive art or something that is closer to entertainment. So what is important here? What is important is actually to ask ourselves as a society if we want to also spend some time talking to each other, learning something and exchanging and investing or not. If not, the solution is clear. If yes, then we need to lobby because it's not going to happen by itself. Right now, we need to lobby, we need to demand it. And these demands can be done because historically they existed. In the 60s and the 50s, I think even in very poor places, you can say, Chus, this is a question of money. It is a question of money. But it's not only a question of countries with money, it's also not a question of governments with money. It's a question of the design, of how you want to design it. It was moments in the 50s where many public art schools had an atelier with one or two artists inside. And this is not science fiction. And this, of course, modifies the way that your children interact with art, but also with each other. Why were these ateliers put, for example, in Mexico in the 50s? They were put there for quite an interesting reason, not only for the reason of art, but for the reason of violence. So today we talk about mobbing in the schools, about people really not being able to relate. Well, there is methods, but we are not exploring them. I think we are, and like it is like yesterday, no? All the governments, but the Spanish government agree on 5% more weapons.
No, the Spanish didn't.
At the end, because of mobbing. So it is interesting that we could also question if we want to spend this money like this, or we want to spend the money, for example, as a very interesting Swiss article that my husband mentioned to me, said that perhaps one way of defeating a potential danger of Russia attacking was to have energy independence. It means to invest in other types of producing energy, for example. So what I mean is that we need actually a conversation going on. And this is the experience, the conversation going on. If in the museum you put it more or less, would be great if it happened. But in my opinion, we need to do a more 360-degree analysis of what's going on, because it's not only the museum, and it's not only the responsibility of the museum. It would be great if the museum could solve it in one go, but I think that is, we need to solve it together in many moments of the social.
Bene, io vi chiederei un applauso per le nostre due ospiti e Thank you very much. E ovviamente la conversazione, come vi ho detto prima, può continuare con altre domande davanti a un calice di vino per fare anche un brindisi. Grazie a tutti di aver partecipato e vi aspettiamo ai prossimi appuntamenti.
Grazie.